Okay, let's look at some examples on the distributive property. And we'll try to adjust my light a little bit there. And this is with simplifying expressions in the distributive property. And so let's look first of all at 5 times x minus 4. Now, this is made up, and the distributive property is always a distribution over a distribution of a multiplication over a addition or subtraction. And I'm going to do some fancy color coding here to see if I can help explain what's going on. And I'm hoping that the colors show up nice. And I'm hoping that they do so that you can see. At least my words will anyway. So the 5 is going to be multiplied, and it's multiplied through the x minus 4. And so what we want to do is multiply the 5 and the x and the 5 and the 4 over that subtraction. And what we want to do next is take that 5 and we want to multiply 5 times the x, and we want to, and there's a couple of ways we can think of this. So we can either think of the subtract, then the 5 times the 4. And what we can do is multiply, and we have 5 times x, which would be 5x, minus the 5 times the 4, which would then be 20. Or we can think of it as 5 times the x, and then I'll come over here and we'll use just a neutral color and make that plus sign. Five times a negative 4. Well, 5 times x is 5x, plus 5 times 4 is negative 20, and we don't like to write two signs, so we would write that as 5x minus 20, or you could write it this way and both would be correct. This is the preferable way to write this. We can go on to the next problem. Okay, let's look at the next problem. Negative 2 times x plus 3. And again, we want to multiply the negative 2 times the x and the negative 2 times the 3. And the way that I do these problems is I do something called SNV. And as I do it, I take care of what my sign is going to be, what my number is going to be, and what my variable will be as I multiply, because that way I've taken care of the 3 parts of this term, because the term will be made up of these 3 parts: signs, numbers, and variables, and that way I can remember to take care of every part. So when I multiply a negative 2 times an x, what sign will that be? Well, it's going to be a negative, because a negative times a positive is a negative. Then what number will it be? Well, 2 times 1 is 2. And then what variable will it have? Well, it has an x. And then I'm going to do the same thing when I multiply negative 2 times 3. And again, I can think of it one of two ways. I can think of it as minus 2 times the 3, or I can think of it as negative 2 times the x plus the negative 2 times the 3. In either case, the first term is still that negative 2x. The negative times the positive is a negative. Take care of the sign first. And negative 2 times 3 is 6. And what we want to get to is that these become our think stage. That this becomes our think stage. And as you slowly do these, you get to the point where you can leave those two think statements out of your process, and you can go straight from the problem to the solution. But as you work them, leave these steps in, one or the other, and from now on I'm just going to do it this way, but you want to leave those statements in until you can get very comfortable with the process. So let's look at the next example, negative 4 times c minus 8, and we want to multiply the negative 4 times the c and the negative 4 times the negative 8. And again, I'm going to do this one in the sign number variable. Negative 4 times c would just be, sign would be a negative times 4 times the c, and then a negative 4 times the negative 8. Negative 4 times c would be negative 4c. Negative times a negative is a positive, the sign first, and then the number, and there is no variable in the second part. Okay, let's look at the next one. Negative 3x minus 2y plus 6. Now there are two ways to look at this problem. In this problem, we can think of this as being the opposite. And the opposite of what's inside the parentheses. The opposite of a 3x is a negative 3x. The opposite of a negative 2y or subtracting 2y is to add 2y, and the opposite of adding 6 is to subtract 6. And it just becomes the opposite. The second way to think of this, and it gets you the same answer, is to think of that same problem and instead of thinking of it as the opposite, you can think of it as multiplying by negative 1. And so it would be negative 1 times 3x, and then a negative 1 times the negative 2y, and then the negative 1 times the 6. And that'd be a positive 6 there, or plus, you can put the plus 6 first, then times the negative 1 in either order. Okay, a negative 1 times a positive 3, sign would be a negative, number would be 3, and then the variable. A negative times a negative is a positive, so that's going to change that to an addition. 1 times 2 is 2, then the variable is a y, sign, number, variable. Then a negative times a positive is a, I'm thinking negative and wrote positive. The negative times a positive is a negative. 1 times 6 is 6. And notice that gives us the exact same answer that we have here. So we get the same answer irregardless of which way that we do the problem. Okay, let's go on to the next example. And I have negative 4 times x minus 2 plus 3. So this problem combines distributive property with combining like terms. And this is where we can simplify and then add like terms. Again, the first thing we're going to do is use the distributive property. So it's going to be, and I'm going to do the -4 in the orange here times x, and then -4 times -2, and then that +3. Notice that this end parentheses acts as a stop sign. That's where we stop distributing. That +3 just falls down at the end. Then the sign is negative, the number is 4, the variable is x. The sign is positive, the number is 8, and there is no variable, +3. Now we need to look to see if we have any like terms. And sure enough, these are like terms because neither one has a variable part. So we can add a +8 and a +3. So it's going to be -4x plus 8, 9, 10, 11. 8 and 3 is 11. And as our last example, -4 times x minus 2 plus 5 plus 2x. And again, that's going to be -4 times x, and yes, I know it's the same, whoops, times x minus 4 times a -2 plus 5 plus 2x. That gives me -4x. A -4 times a -2 gives me +8 plus 5 plus 2x. Well, these are like terms and give me 8 and 5, which is 13. And these are like terms, and a -4 and a +2 gives me a -2, and keep that variable part. And I have to have a sign here, and that's a +13, so I'll put a +13 there, and that gives me an answer of a -2x plus 13. Hope this was helpful. If you need some additional help, be sure you stop by the Math Lab in MBS 222.